I still remember the first crash. The deep, shuddering groan of splintering wood, the piercing crack of glass shattering, the distant, detached realization that my childhood home, the house my grandfather built with his own hands, was being destroyed, and I was powerless to stop it. I had fought them for years, fought the fines, the endless complaints, the manufactured violations. I had thought I was prepared for anything the HOA could throw at me. But I had been wrong. You can't do this. My voice was raw with fury as I faced Karen Thompson, the president of the Homeowners Association. She stood there, arms crossed, manicured fingers resting against her crisp navy blue blazer. Smug, pleased, triumphant. Her smile was as sharp as a blade. "Mr. Johnson," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You had ample warning. The board voted unanimously. Your house was in violation of multiple community codes, and we are within our legal right to proceed." She handed me a folder, an official-looking document stamped with bold red letters reading "Final Notice." But I didn't bother looking. It didn't matter. This was always the plan. They had wanted my land from the beginning. The notices, the fines, the endless paperwork. It was all just a formality to get here. To this moment. I turned to the demolition crew. 5 men in bright orange vests, their hard hats gleaming in the morning sun, as they climbed into their bulldozers and excavators, waiting for the signal. "Don't," I said, my voice low, dangerous. "Don't you dare!" Karen just smiled, clapped her hands. The bulldozer's engine roared to life. The ground trembled beneath my feet as the machine lurched forward. Neighbors stood in clusters along the sidewalk, whispering among themselves, watching me like I was some spectacle, like my entire life was just another HOA meeting debate. Some of them looked guilty. Others nodded in approval. And then, impact. The first strike sent a deafening crack through the air. The front porch, where my mother used to sit on summer evenings, sipping sweet tea, collapsed inward, crumbling under the weight of the metal claw. The second blow splintered the front door, tearing it from its hinges like it was nothing more than paper. A thick cloud of dust billowed up into the sky, swallowing everything in a haze of destruction. The once familiar outline of my home blurred, twisting into something unrecognizable. Something gone. I forced myself to watch. Forced myself to memorize every single moment of my home being turned to rubble. A photograph fluttered from the wreckage. My parents on their wedding day, frozen in time in a shattered wooden frame. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms so hard I thought they'd draw blood. But I refused to look at Karen. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. And then, something strange happened. A loud metallic clang. The bulldozer came to an abrupt halt. The operator frowned, tapping at his controls, but the machine wouldn't budge. Another worker, a burly man with a clipboard, hurried forward, waving at the driver to cut the engine. "Something's under there," the operator called out, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. The workers moved cautiously, brushing aside debris. Then they froze. Karen took a slow step forward. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Keep going. This house needs to be cleared." But no one was listening, because half buried beneath the wreckage, protruding from the splintered remains of my family's foundation, was a vault. A massive, rusted steel vault. The kind you'd find in an old bank. The kind that wasn't meant to be found. A slow hush spread through the crowd. The workers hesitated, their faces pale. Some looked at each other. Some looked at me. But most of them looked at Karen. And for the first time since I had met her, Karen Thompson wasn't smiling. She was rigid, stiff, her fingers curled into tight fists at her sides. She knew. She knew exactly what that vault was. But the real question was, why didn't I? I took a slow step forward, dust swirling around my boots. The sunlight hit the vault's surface at an angle, illuminating faded markings, numbers, letters, something scratched away over time. My heart pounded as I ran my fingers over the cool metal. The bolts were massive, the hinges rusted, like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. A sudden gust of wind carried Karen's sharp voice over the stunned silence. "This changes nothing," she snapped, regaining some of her usual arrogance. Demolition will continue. This isn't a public spectacle. You're trespassing. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. The driver of the bulldozer wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, hesitating. Ms. Thompson, he said slowly. This thing, it's not on the blueprints. We can't just... I don't care about some old junk buried under this house, Karen cut him off. Get rid of it, now. But no one moved, because now the neighbors were stepping closer, murmuring among themselves. I could see the way they glanced between the vault and Karen, the way suspicion flickered in their eyes. I turned to her, watching her carefully. You knew this was here. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course I didn't. But her voice wavered. Just barely. And I caught it. The first crack in her armor. The workers were waiting. The neighbors were watching. The HOA board members standing near Karen were suddenly too quiet. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about my home. This was about something much bigger. I stepped toward the vault, brushing off a layer of dust and debris. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I expected to find. Old family documents? Some forgotten safe that had been sealed before I was born? But something about Karen's reaction told me this wasn't just any vault. This was a secret someone had gone to great lengths to keep buried. And now, after all these years, after all their efforts to erase it, it was finally coming to the surface. The vault sat there, half buried in the ruins of my childhood home, its rusted steel frame bathed in the late morning sun. The silence was almost suffocating. The demolition crew had shut off their machines. The gathered neighbors had stopped whispering. Even Karen, for the first time in her smug, self-righteous life, had nothing to say. My fingers traced the cool metal, brushing away years of dust and grime. Up close, I could see faint engravings, almost completely worn away by time. Letters, numbers, some kind of code. Step away from that! Karen's voice snapped like a whip, her heels clicking loudly against the broken concrete. I turned, locking eyes with her. There it was again, the flicker of fear. It was small, nearly imperceptible, but it was there. She knew something. I took a deliberate step closer to the vault. What is this, Karen? She scoffed, but her fingers twitched, a nervous tick. It's old junk, some relic from before the community was built. It has nothing to do with you. But that was a lie, and I could prove it. This is my land, I shot back, voice steady. That means whatever's inside this thing, it belongs to me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I could feel their curiosity growing, their attention shifting. Karen had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a tyrant, but now, for the first time, she wasn't in control, and she hated it. I turned to the demolition crew, specifically the bulldozer operator, whose machine had unearthed the vault in the first place. Help me get this open. Karen lunged forward, panic flashing across her face. Absolutely not. I stared her down. Why? What's inside that's got you so scared? Her mouth opened, then shut. No clever retorts, no fake legal jargon, just silence. And that's when I knew. I wasn't the only one interested in this vault. The tension broke when a gruff voice spoke up from the crowd. That vault was never supposed to be found. All heads turned toward Mr. Harold Winslow, an old man who had lived in this neighborhood long before the HOA ever existed. He stood near the curb, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Karen's face paled. What do you mean? I asked, stepping forward. Winslow exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. This land, it wasn't always like this. Before the HOA, before the suburban development, this entire area used to be farmland. And that vault? He nodded toward it. It's been here longer than any of us, longer than the houses, longer than the streets. It's not supposed to be opened. A chill crept up my spine. Karen practically bolted toward Winslow. You don't know what you're talking about, old man, she hissed, voice dangerously low. Winslow glared at her. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do you. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The mood had changed. I looked back at the vault. There was something unsettling about it. The way it had been buried so deep beneath my home, hidden, not forgotten, sealed away on purpose. "How do we open it?" I asked. Winslow hesitated. Then, with a heavy sigh, he pointed at the faded engravings. "Those numbers, they ain't just decoration, that's a combination lock. And if it's still functional..." The implications hung in the air. Karen stepped forward, shaking her head violently. "This is ridiculous. This is trespassing. This is..." "Why do you care so much about keeping it shut?" I interrupted. She froze, just for a second. But I caught it. Winslow did too. He nodded at me. "Kid, whatever's in that vault, it's worth a hell of a lot more than this house, than this entire neighborhood. That's why she's scared." Karen clenched her jaw so tightly her face reddened. "This has gone on long enough. I am calling the authorities." I ignored her, focusing on Winslow. "Do you know the combination?" Winslow shook his head. "Number. But I know someone who might." He turned to the crowd, scanning the faces, then settled on one in particular. Mrs. Abernathy. She was in her 70s, frail but sharp-eyed, her silver hair tied into a neat bun. She'd lived here for decades, long before Karen had wormed her way onto the HOA board. Abernathy's lips pressed together in a thin line. "I never thought I'd see that thing again," she murmured. A collective shudder went through the crowd. "You know what's inside?" I asked. She hesitated. Her eyes flickered to Karen, who was gripping her phone so hard her knuckles had gone white. Then, slowly, she met my gaze. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But my husband did. He worked for the original developers before they sold the land to the HOA. He told me once, late at night, after one too many drinks, that they found something on this land. Something valuable." My pulse quickened. "What kind of valuable?" She swallowed hard. "Not money, not gold, something bigger. He never told me the details, only that they were paid to forget it existed. That's why they buried it before the first houses were even built." A sharp breath from Karen. Panic. The demolition workers had gone silent. The neighbors hung on every word. I took a step toward the vault. "Then it's time we find out the truth." Karen exploded. "This is unlawful," she shrieked. "You have no right to open that. It's private property. It belongs to the HOA." I turned, fully facing her. If it was private property, then why was it buried beneath my house? She had no answer. Instead, she did the one thing I never expected. She ran. Not a retreat. Not a graceful exit. She turned on her heel and ran. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen bolted toward her car, fumbling for her keys. The HOA board members, her loyal enforcers, just stood there, stunned. Like they'd just realized they had been following a woman who wasn't actually in control. She yanked open her car door and threw herself inside. The tires screeched against the pavement as she sped off, leaving behind everything. Silence. And then, chaos. What just happened? What's in there? Why is she running? But I didn't waste time with questions. I turned back to Abernathy. "Do you know the combination?" Her lips parted. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. The crowd went dead silent. Winslow took a shaky breath. "Kid, once you open that, you can't undo it. You sure you want to?" I looked at the vault, looked at the destruction of my home, looked at the empty road where Karen had disappeared. Then I nodded. "Let's open it." The weight of the moment pressed against my chest as Mrs. Abernathy slowly approached the vault, her frail fingers tracing the rusted metal. The crowd had fallen into a hushed anticipation, eyes darting between her and the massive steel door embedded in the earth. Karen was gone, having fled like a guilty criminal, but her panic still lingered in the air. "This was never supposed to be opened," Abernathy whispered, more to herself than anyone else. I swallowed hard. Then why was it buried here? She hesitated, her eyes scanning the engravings on the metal surface, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the combination lock. My husband never told me the full truth, she admitted. But he said that whatever's inside, it was meant to be hidden, forgotten. He always said that if anyone ever tried to open it, nothing good would come from it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Then why did he keep the combination? I asked. She let out a small, dry laugh. Because curiosity is a curse. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt their unease. Hell, I felt my own unease. But I had come too far to turn back now. Let's find out, I said, my voice steady. Abernathy took a deep breath, and then, with painstaking slowness, began turning the dials on the vault's lock. Left. Right. Left again. The crowd held its breath as the final number clicked into place. A beat of silence, and then a deep, mechanical groan echoed through the air. The vault door shifted. People stepped back as the old hinges creaked, dust and rust flaking off as the steel door began to inch open. And then the smell hit us. A musty, metallic scent, thick with time and something else, something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't rot. It wasn't decay. It was old, preserved, artificial. I reached for my phone's flashlight, stepping closer despite every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. The vault's interior was dark, not just dark, but completely void of light. The air that seeped out was stale, untouched for decades. And then my beam of light swept across something inside. And the moment it did, Mrs. Abernathy let out a sharp gasp and stumbled backward, clutching her chest. "Oh my God!" she choked. I turned the flashlight fully toward the object inside the vault, and my blood ran cold. There, sitting neatly in the center of the concrete chamber, was a box. Not just any box. A metallic container, sleek, undamaged by time, almost futuristic despite being buried for decades. Unlike the rusted vault around it, this box looked new. And then I saw it. The engraving on its side. Not a name. Not an identification number. Just a symbol. A government insignia. A symbol I had only ever seen in history books. Mrs. Abernathy's breathing was ragged. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "What is it?" I asked, my voice tight. She reached out, hesitating before brushing her fingers over the engraving. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. "My husband worked for the original developers, yes, but before that, he worked for the government." She turned to me, eyes wide. "And he always told me, when they bury something, it's because they don't want it to be found." I glanced back at the box, heart hammering against my ribs. "So what's inside?" I asked. Abernathy shook her head. "I don't know, but I do know one thing." She turned to the crowd, her expression grim. "Karen knew about this, and she just ran." Silence fell over the group. I took a deep breath and stepped inside the vault. As soon as my foot hit the concrete floor, a faint click echoed through the chamber. The breath caught in my throat. The next sound was worse, a mechanical whir. From the ceiling of the vault, a red light flickered to life. And suddenly, a voice, cold, robotic, and decades old, filled the space around us. "Unauthorized access detected." The crowd gasped, and my stomach dropped. The vault wasn't just a storage unit. It was a warning, and we had just set it off. The robotic voice echoed through the vault, sending a chill down my spine. "Unauthorized access detected." A low, mechanical whir reverberated from somewhere deep within the chamber, a sound that didn't belong in something this old. The red light above flickered erratically, like it was struggling to function after years of dormancy. Mrs. Abernathy staggered backward, clutching at her chest as if her heart might give out. "What did you do?" someone in the crowd whispered. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The air inside the vault had changed, thicker, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. And then, beneath the mechanical hum, I heard something else. A click, and then another. A series of locks disengaging. The metallic box, the government-sealed container, was unlocking itself. I took a slow, cautious step forward. The edges of the box were smooth, seamless, except for the indentation on the front where the latches had been hidden. The metal surface was cool, even though the vault was stuffy with age. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered under my breath. Abernathy's voice was barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." The crowd had backed away, murmuring in hushed voices, their earlier excitement replaced by a deep, unsettled fear. No one wanted to be the first to leave. No one wanted to be the first to stay either. I swallowed hard and reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the container. And then, the final lock disengaged with a sharp metallic snap. The lid cracked open by less than an inch, but the effect was immediate. A hiss escaped from the box, like air being released from a pressurized chamber. The smell was sharp, chemical, sterile, unnatural. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse hammering in my throat. "What the hell is in there?" Someone in the crowd gasped. I looked at Abernathy, searching her expression for answers, but she looked just as bewildered as the rest of us. But then, a sound came from inside the box. A faint, rhythmic beeping. A slow, pulsing noise that felt wrong in every possible way. Abernathy's breath hitched. No. That should have stopped years ago. What should have stopped? I demanded. But she wasn't listening to me anymore. Her hands were shaking violently, her entire body trembling as she stared at the cracked open box like it contained something alive. "This isn't right," she whispered, backing away toward the vault entrance. "It was supposed to stay buried. They promised it would stay buried." I turned back to the box, my skin prickling with an overwhelming sense of dread. The beeping continued, slow and steady, each pulse slicing through the heavy silence like a countdown to something none of us understood. Then I did the one thing every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to do. I lifted the lid. The moment I did, the vault's red light flared, casting everything in an eerie blood-colored glow. The beeping sped up. And inside the box, a small black device. It was no bigger than a shoebox, sleek and unmarked, but unmistakably high-tech. Wires snaked from its sides, leading to a digital screen that flickered erratically, struggling to come to life after decades in the dark. The screen finally steadied, and then, all at once, it displayed a date that hadn't happened yet, a future timestamp. And below it, a single blinking message. Standby activation, 002357. The timer was counting down. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What is this?" I whispered. Abernathy was clutching the wall now, gasping for air, her voice barely holding together. "They told him it was just storage," she choked out. "They said it was harmless, just an old project being decommissioned. He never knew." "Who never knew?" I demanded. She turned to me, eyes wet and wild with fear. "My husband," she whispered. "He was told it was classified, that no one would ever find it." I turned back to the device, my hands shaking. The timer had dropped to 002235. 22 minutes. Something inside me screamed that we needed to leave. Now I looked to the crowd, expecting someone, anyone, to say something. But they were frozen, their eyes fixed on the countdown as if hypnotized. And then, outside the vault, engines, multiple engines. The deep, guttural growl of black SUVs pulling up to the property. Doors slammed, heavy boots hit the ground, and then, a voice amplified through a megaphone. "Step away from the vault. Put your hands where we can see them." A pulse of pure panic shot through me. I turned to Abernathy. "Did you call someone?" She shook her head furiously. But Karen did." My stomach dropped. Of course. She had run because she knew what we would find. And she hadn't just run. She had told someone. The crowd inside the vault was dead silent, caught between the terror of the countdown and the unseen forces waiting just beyond the entrance. I turned back to the device. 002012. Every instinct I had screamed that we were in way over our heads. And as I looked back at the dark figures moving toward us, I realized something else. We had just become witnesses to something we were never supposed to see. The air inside the vault had turned suffocating. The countdown on the screen continued its relentless march forward, the glowing red numbers reflecting off the walls like the final moments of some unspeakable event we had just set into motion. 00-1947. Outside, the heavy crunch of boots against gravel sent waves of cold dread through my body. They were getting closer. "We need to leave now," I hissed, snapping out of my shock. But the others, Abernathy, the crowd, they were still frozen in place, their eyes locked onto the device as if waiting for it to tell them what to do. Then came the voice again, booming through a megaphone. "Step away from the vault! This is a restricted site! You are trespassing on federal property!" I looked at Abernathy, but she wasn't moving. She was staring at the device. I followed her gaze. The countdown had accelerated. It was moving faster now. 00-1855, 00-1830. "Why is it speeding up?" I whispered. Abernathy's breath came in short, ragged bursts. I don't know. It shouldn't be doing that." I grabbed her by the shoulders. "Then tell me, what the hell is this thing?" Her eyes were glossy with fear, her body trembling beneath my grip. "It's a fail-safe," she choked out. "A contingency. But he never knew what it was for. They lied to him." The he she was referring to was her late husband, the government engineer who had stored this box away decades ago, and now we had awakened it. Another voice crackled through the megaphone, this time harsher. "This is your final warning. Hands where we can see them. Do not interfere with the object." Object. That's what they were calling it. I turned to the crowd. "We have to move. Get out of here before they—" Too late. A flashbang detonated just outside the vault entrance. A searing blast of light and sound erupted through the narrow chamber. The shockwave sent a deep, piercing ring through my ears, disorienting me instantly. I staggered backward, gripping my head as the world blurred. I could see Abernathy collapse to her knees, clutching at her ears, while the others screamed and scrambled blindly for cover. The device on the table beeped. It was reacting to the chaos. 00-1500. The countdown had cut another 3 minutes off its time. No. The shadows at the entrance shifted. Armed figures in tactical gear stormed into the vault, their faces concealed behind black helmets and visors. "On the ground! Now!" 2 of them grabbed Mrs. Abernathy before she could react. Another shoved me down onto the cold stone floor, twisting my arms behind my back. I gasped, my chest pressing against the ground as they zip-tied my wrists. The others, our neighbors, our friends, were being restrained one by one, forced against the ground as if we were criminals. The only thing left standing was the box, and it was still counting down. The highest-ranking officer, a man with a deep, cutting voice, knelt beside the table. His uniform bore no name, no agency, only a symbol I didn't recognize. He studied the screen, his lips tightening. "Damn it! They triggered it!" One of the other officers hesitated. "Sir, if it's running a protocol—" "We don't have time," the leader snapped. He turned to another soldier. "Call it in. Tell them Site Echo 17 is live." Echo 17? That wasn't the name of this place. It wasn't the vault. It wasn't anything I had ever heard of. But these men, they knew what the device was. I forced myself to speak, even as my breath came out uneven. "You have to stop it." The leader barely spared me a glance. "You should have never come here." He turned the device over. For the first time, I saw the bottom of the box. There was another screen, and on it, a second set of numbers. LAT, 39.7392 degrees north. LONG, 104.9903 degrees west a location. I didn't recognize the coordinates, but someone else did. Mrs. Abernathy's breath hitched. I turned to her, watching as all the color drained from her face. "It's not a bomb, is it?" I whispered. Her lips trembled. "Number, it's worse." And then, the man with no name took a deep breath and pressed something on the screen. The countdown vanished. In its place, a single word appeared. Transmitting. The vault shuddered. Outside, the sky rumbled, but there wasn't a cloud in sight. A hum, deep and unnatural, vibrated through the air. It didn't sound like any machine I had ever heard. And then, somewhere far away, a siren began to wail. Not just one. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. From a place I could not see, a place I could not name. The lead officer's radio crackled with frantic voices. They were shouting coordinates, orders. Abernathy's breathing turned to shallow gasps. I didn't understand. But she did. Because as we lay there, restrained on the floor of a vault no one was supposed to enter, she whispered, barely audible over the rising sirens in the distance. Oh, God. What have we just started? The sirens in the distance didn't fade. They multiplied. The vault floor trembled beneath me, sending a shudder up my spine. The radio on the lead officer's shoulder crackled with voices speaking in rushed, clipped tones. Too fast. Too urgent. I could only make out fragments. Confirmed signal. Activating protocol blackout. It's moving. Moving. I twisted my head to look at the device, but the screen no longer displayed a countdown. Instead, it showed a signal strength meter, fluctuating wildly as it transmitted whatever information it had just unlocked. And Mrs. Abernathy? She had gone pale, her entire body trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age. You need to tell me what's happening, I whispered, barely able to get the words out past the weight of panic settling in my chest. She turned her wide, tear-brimmed eyes toward me. It was never supposed to be found. The officer kneeling beside the device let out a sharp breath. We need to shut this down now. He turned to his men. Cut the power to the entire sector, block satellite relays, everything. One of the soldiers hesitated. Sir, we don't even know what it's transmitting. The officer's eyes darkened. Exactly. But before he could move, Abernathy lurched forward. She didn't care that her wrists were zip-tied, didn't care that there were weapons trained on her. She scrambled toward the device like a woman possessed. The lead officer barked a warning. Too late. Her fingers slammed onto the screen, tapping furiously at something only she understood. The device let out a single high-pitched beep. Then, everything stopped. The vibrations, the humming, the static in the air. Even the distant sirens cut off mid-wail, as if the world itself had been muted. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the unsteady rise and fall of our own breathing. Abernathy's shoulders sagged. I stopped it, she whispered, voice shaking. I shut it down. The officers around us didn't look relieved. They looked terrified. The lead officer's fingers dug into the earpiece he was wearing. Control, confirm. Silence. Control, do you read? Nothing. His men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them pressed a hand to the radio at his hip, adjusting frequencies. Still, silence. It took me a second to realize what had just happened. It wasn't just the sirens that had stopped. It was everything. The radio. The emergency frequencies. The static of an open channel. Every device, every transmission in range, had gone completely dark. No interference, no scrambled signals. Just nothing. The lead officer locked eyes with Abernathy. What did you do? She was still staring at the device, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. I cut the transmission. To what? She swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she turned toward him. To whatever was listening. A long, heavy silence settled over the room. Then, the lights flickered. The overhead bulbs dimmed, buzzing like something had drained their energy in a single, hungry pulse. A low hum rumbled through the vault again. Faint at first. Then louder. It wasn't coming from the device anymore. It was coming from above us. The officer's hand shot up. Move. Now. The soldiers grabbed us, Abernathy, myself, the others, dragging us toward the exit. I stumbled, my hands still tied, my legs barely keeping up as we were forced up the narrow tunnel leading back to the surface. The moment we emerged into the open air, I knew. Everything had changed. The sky above us, once clear and blue, was wrong. The stars. They were visible. At noon. The clouds didn't move, the trees didn't sway. The world looked stuck, frozen in place. One of the officers turned on his radio. "Control, respond. What the hell is going on up there?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a voice. But not the one we expected. Not static. Not human. Something else. Something that had been listening all along. "Transmission received. We are here." The officer's breath caught in his throat. The radio dropped from his hands. And far in the distance, past the hills, something stepped forward. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. And we had woken it up.